This day and time. What happened today, years ago.
We're jumping right in today, taking a close look at some really interesting source material you sent our way.
That's right. Yeah, we've got articles, notes, bits of research, all focusing on, well, a surprisingly significant date, June 16th.
Not just one June 16th, though.
No, exactly. 3 distinct moments, different centuries, different places.
And the core idea here, the sort of mission this material gives us, is exploring these 3 events. Battle of Stoke 1487, Siege of Louisbourg, 1745, and Braddock's campaign, 1755, through one common thread, power.
Right. The source actually calls it 3 beginnings, one common theme. It's about looking at how power gets, built up, how it expands.
How it's asserted, maybe challenged.
Exactly. Challenged, tested, and sometimes how those tests force change. So we're going to unpack the key bits, the insights from this material to see what these particular June 16ths tell us about that whole dynamic.
Okay, let's do it. First up, England, nearly 540 years ago. June 16th, 1487, the Battle of Stoke Field. The source material really paints a picture here. Henry VIII is king, yeah. Won the crown at Bosworth Field just 2 years before, 85.
But his grip was, well, it wasn't solid yet. Still pretty fragile.
Right.
Yeah, he did the classic thing, tried to unite everyone by marrying Elizabeth of York, bringing the Lancaster and York symbols together in the Tudor rose.
Clever branding.
Clever branding, but you can't just wipe away decades of civil war that easily. There was still a strong Yorkist group out there looking for a way back, and they were focusing on legitimate heirs, like young Edward, the Earl of Warwick.
Which sets up this plot. The source flags John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln. He's important here.
Very. Richard III's nephew, so he had a strong claim himself. And they weren't alone. They got serious money, serious backing from Margaret of Burgundy.
Richard III's sister, right? Hated Henry VII.
Hated him. So she funded an army, but it was kind of a mixed bag force-wise. They had maybe 1,500, 2,000 top-notch German and Swiss mercenaries, the Landsknechts, led by Martin Schwartz. Very professional. But the main chunk of the army, maybe 4,000 to 6,000, were Irish kerns, lighter infantry, led by Thomas Fitzgerald.
And they needed a face for the rebellion. This is where the imposter comes in. Lambert Simnel.
Yeah, a 10-year-old kid, coached to pretend he was the Earl of Warwick.
Wow.
They even crowned him King Edward VI over in Dublin. It sounds, well, a bit ridiculous now.
But the threat was real.
Oh, absolutely. They landed in Lancashire June 4th, 1487. They were hoping, to rally support as they marched south.
Did they?
They won a small skirmish early on. But the key failure, the source points this out, they just couldn't get the English nobles to join them in big numbers. That was critical.
Meanwhile, Henry VII.
He wasn't waiting around. He mobilized fast, pulled together a much bigger army, something like 15,000 men, and marched north to meet them.
Okay, so this leads to the confrontation. June 16th, 1487 at Stoke Field. Rebels have about 8,000.
Roughly, yeah. And they actually had the high ground initially. But Henry's army was almost double the size, maybe 15,000. And crucially, his vanguard, about 6,000 troops, was led by the Earl of Oxford, a really experienced commander.
So how did it play out? The source breaks it down.
It does, into phases.
Yeah.
First, the rebels actually made a pretty bold move. They came down off the high ground to launch a surprise attack on Oxford's vanguard.
Risky. Did it work?
Not really. Oxford's men were veterans, they held firm, and then the English archers, well, they were devastating. The source describes them just pouring arrows into the Irish kerns, who weren't as well armored, and the exposed mercenaries.
Ouch.
Yeah. So the rebel attacks stalled, they're taking heavy losses from the archers, and then Oxford counterattacks.
And that broke them.
Completely broke the rebel lines. The main leaders, Lincoln, Schwartz, Fitzgerald, they were all killed right there in the fighting.
And the aftermath sounds grim.
Incredibly bloody. The survivors fled towards the River Trent, but many got trapped and cut down in this ravine. Apparently, locals still call it Red Gutter.
Goodness. Casualties were high.
Very high for the rebels. Maybe 4,000, even up to 7,000 lost. A huge chunk of their army.
And what about the imposter king, Lambert Simnel?
Captured. But Henry did something quite clever politically. He pardoned the boy, gave him a job. working in the royal kitchens.
A scullion?
A scullion, making the supposed king scrub pots, sends a pretty clear message about who's really in charge. It underscored how secure Henry felt after this.
And Henry didn't just stop at winning the battle, right? He used this moment to really change how power worked in England.
Exactly. The source talks about new laws against private armies, these retaining laws, basically telling nobles, you can't raise your own little armies anymore, only the king's army matters.
Centralizing power.
Right. And he used finances too. Acts of attainder declaring rebels traitors and seizing their lands, punished enemies, rewarded friends. Plus, these things called bonds and recognizances.
What were those?
Basically forcing nobles to put up huge sums of money as a guarantee of good behavior. Financial leverage to ensure loyalty. Very shrewd.
So Stoke Field, it wasn't just another battle.
No, the source argues it was the battle that truly ended the Wars of the Roses. Bosworth got Henry the crown, but Stoke Field secured it. It cemented Tudor power and paved the way for that strong, centralized state they built.
Okay, so that June 16th, 1487, it's about consolidating power, taking military victory and turning it into lasting political control.
Precisely, solidifying rule through force, then through law and finance, changing the rules of the game.
Right, let's shift gears. Jump forward quite a bit. Across the Atlantic now, June 16, 1745, the Siege of Louisbourg.
Yeah, different kind of power dynamic here. Not consolidating after Civil War, but maybe seeing power expand within an empire.
Okay, Louisbourg. Where was this and why was it important?
It was France's major fortress in North America, on Cape Breton Island, modern-day Nova Scotia. Hugely strategic. It basically controlled the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
So key for access to Canada.
Key for Canada, key for French fishing fleets. And for the British colonies in New England, it was a constant threat right on their doorstep. A base for French privateers raiding their ships, disrupting trade.
And the source says the trigger for this siege was the French capturing an English fishing port nearby, Canso, in 1744.
That seems to be the spark, yeah. It really pushed New England, especially Massachusetts, to say, okay, enough is enough. We need to deal with Louisbourg.
And the force that went to do it was unusual.
Very unusual for the time. They got crucial help from the British Royal Navy under Commodore Peter Warren controlling the sea. But the land force was almost entirely colonial militia, about 4,200 guys, mostly from Massachusetts.
Not British regulars.
No, led by a colonial merchant, William Pepperell. The whole thing was initiated by the governor of Massachusetts, William Shirley. It was a colonial project, really.
And the siege itself sounds tough. The source mentions dragging cannons through swamps.
Oh, incredibly difficult. They landed in early May, and yeah, they had to haul these massive siege guns over miles of marshy, boggy ground to get them into position around the fortress walls. You can just imagine the effort.
Grueling.
Absolutely. But they got a huge break early on. The French made a pretty big blunder. They abandoned the Grand Battery,
What was that?
a key defensive fort outside the main walls. The colonists just walked in, captured it, and then used its own cannons against Louisbourg.
Wow, bit of luck there.
Definitely helped. They also set up batteries over at Lighthouse Point to bombard another key spot, the Island Battery, which guarded the harbor entrance.
Was it all smooth sailing after that? The source mentions a failed attack.
Yeah, there was one setback. A night assault on that Island Battery, June 6th. It didn't go well. They lost about 60 killed, over 100 captured.
But they kept the pressure on.
They did. The bombardment continued, and the source highlights our date, June 16th, 17th, as the culmination. Around then, the Island Battery was finally knocked out, neutralized. That meant the harbor was wide open to the British fleet.
Leaving the French commander.
Du Chambon. He saw the writing on the wall. No way to hold out. He surrendered Louisbourg.
That must have been a huge deal.
Massive! A complete shock back in Europe, London, and Paris. These colonists had taken one of France's strongest fortresses, but in America, just immense pride, a real feeling of accomplishment.
So this fits the expansion theme. Colonial power proving itself.
I think so, yeah. They organized it, largely funded it, supplied the manpower, and pulled off a major military victory. It showed what the colonies were capable of, acting within the imperial system, but kind of on their own initiative.
But there's a twist, right? The political fallout wasn't quite what they expected.
No, that's the kicker. The war ends a few years later. Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748. And what happens? Britain gives Louisbourg back to France.
What? After all that?
Why? In exchange for territory elsewhere, like Madras in India. Classic European power politics. But for the New Englanders who fought and died to take it.
They must have been furious.
deeply resentful. It felt like London just didn't get it, didn't value their sacrifice, traded away their victory for some far-off place. It really drove home that their interests and London's weren't always aligned.
They could see how that plants seeds of discontent.
Absolutely. The source connects this directly. It fostered a sense of colonial identity, maybe independence, and definitely frustration with being treated like pawns. It even mentions veterans from Louisbourg turning up years later at Lexington and Concord, fighting against the British.
Wow. So June 16, 1745, it marks this peak of colonial military achievement and expansion of their power. But the aftermath actually creates friction, setting the stage for future challenges to that very imperial power.
Exactly. A success that, paradoxically, highlighted the growing gap between the colonies and the mother country.
Okay, let's move forward again. Just 10 years this time. June 16, 1755. A different story. Imperial power being asserted, but then running into trouble, being tested.
Right. We're still in North America, but the focus shifts inland to the Ohio country. This was the real hotspot, the disputed zone between Britain and France.
Where Pittsburgh is now.
Exactly. The French were building forts there to stake their claim. Fort Duquesne was the big one, and this is where George Washington had that earlier run-in, the Fort Necessity skirmish in '54.
So Britain decides they need to push the French out decisively.
Yes. They send a major expedition, regular British Army troops this time, led by Major General Edward Braddock. About 2,400 men in total, regulars and some colonial militia.
And Washington's involved again.
He is, a bit older now, 23, serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp to Braddock, learning the ropes of regular army campaigning.
So the campaign kicks off in late May 55. Where does June 16th fit in?
June 16th finds them deep in the hardest part of the whole operation, building the road. Braddock's Road. They literally had to chop and clear a path through hundreds of miles of dense Appalachian wilderness.
Just to get the army and its supplies to Fort Duquesne.
Exactly. Talk about asserting power, physically carving your way into contested territory. It was slow, brutal work.
Sounds incredibly difficult.
It was, so much so that Braddock got impatient. The source notes he decided to split his force. He took about 1,400 of the fittest men in a flying column to push ahead faster, leaving the heavy baggage train and slower troops behind.
Trying to speed things up.
Right. Now, the famous battle, the disaster, wasn't on June 16th itself. That happened later, July 9th, near the Monongahela River.
Okay.
And the source stresses it was a meeting engagement, kind of a chance encounter, not really a planned ambush. They ran into a much smaller French and Native American force, maybe 900 total.
So June 16th is part of the process of asserting power, building the road. July 9th is when that assertion gets tested.
Exactly. And it failed the test dramatically. The source points to the core problem: tactics. Braddock's army was trained for European warfare, fighting in neat lines, firing volleys.
Which doesn't work in the woods.
Not at all. The French and their native allies knew the terrain. They used cover, fired from behind trees, flanked the British column, hit and fade. The source mentions they specifically targeted the British officers who stood out.
Causing chaos in the ranks.
Complete breakdown of command. Braddock himself was fatally wounded. Washington, despite being just an aide, showed real courage trying to rally the troops and organize some kind of retreat.
But the losses were bad.
Terrible for the British. Almost 1,000 killed or wounded out of that 1,400-man column. The French and native losses were minimal in comparison. A stunning defeat.
What happened next?
It got worse, actually. Colonel Dunmar, who commanded the rear column with the supplies, basically panicked when the survivors straggled back. He ordered tons of valuable supplies and wagons destroyed.
Why?
To speed up his retreat, he pulled the entire remaining force all the way back to Philadelphia.
Leaving the frontier completely exposed.
Wide open. Led to years of brutal frontier warfare, raids, settlers killed or captured. It was a devastating blow to British prestige and colonial security. A real wake-up call.
But the source says this defeat, this testing, wasn't entirely negative in the long run. It forced change.
Yes, that's a key insight. It was a painful lesson, but Britain learned from it. They realized they had to get serious about logistics in North America, about diplomacy with native tribes. You couldn't just ignore them. And crucially, they had to adapt their fighting style for wilderness warfare.
So the defeat forced adaptation.
It absolutely did. Those hard-won lessons were crucial for later British successes. Like when General Forbes finally took Fort Duquesne in 1758, he used a much more cautious, methodical approach, building fortified supply posts, engaging with native allies. He learned from Braddock's mistakes.
In Washington. How did he come out of this?
Despite the disaster, his personal stock actually rose. He'd shown bravery under fire, had horses shot out from under him while carrying orders, became something of a hero back in Virginia, even got noticed in London. The source calls it his first lesson of war, shaped his caution, his understanding of logistics, his respect for wilderness fighting.
Right. So June 16th, 1755, falls during this confident assertion of imperial power pushing into the wilderness. The battle that followed was the harsh testing of that power against a different reality. A defeat, yes, but one that forced crucial adaptation for future success.
A really stark example of how power, when tested, has to either adapt or break.
So bringing it all together, these three June 16th spanning centuries continents, Stoke, Louisbourg, Braddock's campaign, the source material really ties them nicely through this theme of power.
It does. You see power being consolidated in 1487, Henry VIII winning, then locking down his rule, reshaping the state. Military victory becomes political foundation.
Then 1745, Louisbourg, colonial power expanding militarily, a big success within the empire, but one that sort of ironically fuels future challenges to that empire because of the political fallout.
Right. And 1755, Braddock, imperial power being confidently asserted, then brutally tested by a new environment, leading to defeat, but forcing that painful but necessary reform and adaptation that ultimately make future victories possible.
Consolidation, expansion, assertion, and testing, leading to reform. Three very different facets of power, all linked by this one date.
It's quite striking when you lay them out like that. Makes you think, doesn't it? About how challenge and even failure can be just as formative, maybe even more so, than straightforward success when it comes to power.
That's a great point. Maybe the real deep dive is thinking about how we learn or don't learn from our own setbacks. What are the modern equivalents of Braddock's defeat, forcing us or needing to force us to adapt?
Yeah, are we recognizing when established ways of doing things, established power structures are being tested and found wanting, and are we adapting or just doubling down?
Something definitely worth mulling over. Thanks so much for digging into these sources with us. It's been fascinating to connect these dots across time.
My pleasure. These June 16th certainly give us a lot to think about regarding the nature of power.
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more history daily.